Welcome to the Painting of the Week podcast, where we look at some of the most significant paintings throughout history. Introducing your hosts, Phil Grabsky and Laura Bentham.
So, welcome to this week's Painting of the Week, and it's a very special episode. I'm really thrilled that we're doing this. I'm with Laura, of course, and I'm also with Yvonne Gilleece. We're sitting right now at the Royal Sussex Hospital in Brighton, where both Laura and I and Yvonne live. Yvonne is the chair. Actually, I'll let Yvonne tell me exactly what you are. But I should say, first of all, Yvonne actually listens to the podcast, so thank you very much.
It's handy. It's brilliant.
And came to us with a really very special idea, which we're going to talk about, and an extraordinary artwork, and in fact more than one artwork. But we'll come on to that. But Yvonne, maybe you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. So I'm a professor of HIV medicine working in Brighton, and I'm also chair of the British HIV Association, which is the national organisation to try and improve health outcomes for people living with HIV. And what we try and do is try and inform the public as well as professionals about HIV. And so this is HIV testing week this week, the 5th to the 12th of February. And I just thought it would be, having listened to your podcast, it might be a really nice idea to combine what I do with something creative that is the UK AIDS Memorial Quilt.
Which brings me on to this most extraordinary artwork, because you might be thinking, well, what's the connection? Well, for those of you who haven't heard of it, we'll start with the US AIDS Memorial Quilt. And just to remind you, if you go to 7th-art.com or to the YouTube channel for the podcast, you'll see the most extraordinary picture. And this is when this quilt, which contains 125,000 names, I believe, was laid out in Washington, D.C., on the National Mall, and you just get a sense of how absolutely enormous it is. So here are some statistics. It weighs over 64 tons. I've seen a video showing how this is stored, which in itself is quite extraordinary. If it was laid out, it would cover more than 1.3 million square feet. It is the largest piece of folk art, an ongoing community art project in the world. So, we've talked about paintings by Rembrandt and Van Gogh and Leonardo. This is just as significant as far as I'm concerned. The quilt was begun in November 1985 by a San Francisco-based gay rights activist by the name of Cleve Jones. And it began with a single panel created by Jones for his friend and loved one, Marvin Feldman. And these panels, and in the video I saw, which really kind of hit me like a I don't know what, but they are in the shape of a coffin, or a grave, which is pretty shocking, I suppose. And they kind of fit into blocks, and then these blocks are laid out side by side, and each one has the name of somebody that has been lost. On October the 11th, 1987, it was displayed for the first time in the National Mall, and then again in 1996. It's so huge that obviously it doesn't get laid out. I'm not sure it can even be laid out in its entirety. It's so massive. Now, what of course is interesting also is that it has inspired others to do the same thing, unfortunately, in some ways, of course. So we also have the UK AIDS Memorial Quilt. Now, Laura, you went up last week to have a look at this. So where did you go and what did you see?
Okay, so I went up last week and I thought to myself, Yvonne had mentioned the quilt, so I thought, okay, I'm going to go up, and I didn't want to be what I call internet ready. So I thought I'd like to have the feelings I have as I walk in the room. So me being me, I managed to get my daughter to come with me as well, which is really nice. We arrive in Mile End at a place called Positive East, and I'm thinking they're all going to be hanging up and there's going to be this wonderful display, maybe a little cafe, You know what I'm like, Phil, with my rose-coloured glasses on. Anyway, we walk in, lovely lady, Liz arrives, and she says, "Okay, Laura, we're here, but what you have to go into this little tiny room. It's a bit chilly, but we'll turn the heating on." So, oh, lovely, yeah, great. And then there's 2 hanging on the wall, and then what they then decided we're going to do was get out the rest, which are piled into old garden furniture bags in the corner. So not quite maybe as the American one is. I don't know how they store those.
On shelves, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a really different experience. They turned the heating on, and Liz got us a cup of tea. And then down came Ian, who was head of fundraising, and a guy called Mark, who's the director. And then they proceeded to get out some of the quilts for us, lay them out so we could look at them and photograph some of them. And as you said, when they get laid out, the impact of each one being a coffin size, which then sewn together, there's 8 of them sewn together for these blocks. The UK one, there is 48 blocks. They don't have obviously as many as this. And there are 384 names on these quilts. And it is just such a huge impact. And really, you do have to take a massive deep breath. I mean, Yvonne, you've obviously worked on the wards where you've seen the people that were,
absolutely
mentioned, but it is so tough to see. Just, they've got famous people, obviously. Some of them are just one name because the families and everything didn't necessarily want them to be remembered of how they died.
No, absolutely. And I think, what you're explaining there, even though I work in the context of HIV and have for 30 years, so, at the time when all of this was starting and happening, we didn't have good treatment and people were really sick and invariably died with HIV and AIDS-defining illnesses. Even when I saw the panels at a large HIV conference in 2022, laid out in a big room which was silent, I was completely blown away by how this impacted me. And I had been there, I knew what this was like.
Yeah.
But seeing the scale of this, the names, the amount of emotion and passion put into each and every quilt that was made, each and every panel was different, embodied that person, their family's love, their friends' love. I found it really emotional. And I think as well what you've also said, Laura, is the stigma. The stigma is still the problem. And having a single name, not wanting somebody to be fully identified, unfortunately, despite really good treatment for HIV, meaning people can have a normal length of life, there still is the stigma of living with HIV, both for the individual themselves, but it also comes from outside, from other people and how they judge that person.
There is that sense to it, isn't there, that it's not, people are saying, we are not going to hide from the fact, we're not embarrassed. This is somebody's life that needs to be celebrated, and we're going to put it onto this panel and show everybody that this is a human being like everybody else who unfortunately died because of this, but we're not hiding from it. And you've got 125,000 names. And I think in the video that I watched that Laura sent me, out of 672,000. I suspect a lot of people either didn't know that or forgotten that, or that's a huge, huge toll, isn't it?
Yeah. There were actually, I'm going to shuffle papers. But
shuffle papers.
Everyone knows what I'm like.
While you shuffle papers...
But everyone knows what I'm like. The only thing is, because when I spoke to Ian, who was the head of funding, and they couldn't get all the quilts out, obviously, because we had to pick some. And I said, which one would you like to get out, Ian? So he wanted me, and you can go onto their website and look at each quilt individually.
Because it has to be said that, obviously, this is Painting of the Week podcast.
Yeah.
People listening are interested or very enthusiastic about art. They are extremely creative.
Really
creative. The ones that you
absolutely.
look at
Exactly.
are imaginative and beautifully done.
Exactly.
And these are just done by individuals,
And their families and friends. But So he said to me, "Can I have quilt number 23?"
What is the website, by the way? I wanted to before I forget.
If you actually aidsquiltuk.org.
Okay.
And it's actually a really, really good website.
UK.org.
Because if you do want to go through each individual quilt, it really does work. The first thing I noticed when he laid it out was Rudolf Nureyev was on there. Well, I obviously, over Christmas, was talking about him to somebody, which was even weirder. And then when I looked through some articles of him, how he died, it took me 4 articles to get to the fact that he died from AIDS, which I don't know. This is naive, of course, I didn't even know that they wrote that. I thought they would write something else sometimes because they just wanted to cover it all up always, or if it was an AIDS-related disease. I didn't know how that worked myself. So
in the old days we would have said AIDS, whereas now the language has changed and we would say AIDS-defining illness. But I think you're right. It was one of those words that people did not use in a positive way.
Yeah.
So people either avoided it, skirted around how somebody had died, or they tried to use a different term. So the fact that you found that term is actually quite surprising for someone as famous.
It took me 4 articles.
Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things that Ian wanted us to look at, and I think he was really important about this, was there was a panel, and it's by of an anonymous person, and you can see that there is something. It's covered with safety pins, like a white sheet is over it, and on the panel it says this panel was made by a friend for a friend. The parents do not want this panel shown anywhere. The stigma still exists. Until this changes, this panel will remain covered. A red ribbon is not enough. The quilt is not enough. What will it take? Attitudes must change.
So the name's under there?
The name is under there. There is actually some artwork under there. You could see just a little bit. And I said to Ian, do you think, a bit of a silly thing to say probably, it would ever be seen? And he said, well, not in my lifetime, Laura. This is protest art at its best. That piece is really, really strong. And it really took me, that one.
I mean, one of the first things I did as when I became chair of the British HIV Association was to go on a stigma march last March through the City of London, because HIV stigma still remains such an issue for people living with HIV. And the fact that in 2023 we are still marching, even though we have good treatment. If somebody is on treatment and undetectable, the risk of onward transmission to anybody is 0. So zero risk. It's not low, it's not negligible. It is a 0 risk of transmission if someone's on good treatment for HIV. We still are dealing with stigma, and they face that every single day of their lives. So we marched through the streets of London to shout about it, because we still need to shout about it.
Yeah.
And that's so many years later, even with good treatment.
See, I don't know about you, Phil, but I had no idea. I had no idea at all. I just went up, had this nice day out, Yvonne, looking at lovely, you know what I'm like, I love a quilt and things. I knew it was going to be emotional, and and how it humanises everybody and everything else. But it was, the fact that you're on a march. I know you. I didn't know you were on a march.
Yeah.
So the wards here in the Royal Sussex, for example, do they continue to be very busy with continued treatment, or I know you started in 1995, but how long have you been in Brighton?
I've been in Brighton since 2005, and I look after inpatients and outpatients. And we don't have large numbers of inpatients because we now have good treatment. But the inpatients we do have are often very sick, very complex, very scared. And probably the most worrying group of patients are those who are diagnosed late with HIV. So these are people who could have been diagnosed earlier if somebody had thought to do an HIV test. They have often attended other medical services, so GPs, hospitals, with various symptoms, haven't felt well, have lost weight, and yet no one's thought of doing an HIV test, even though they might have done other blood tests. So they're diagnosed at a point where they're very, very sick and often spend a very long time in hospital, sometimes with life-changing disability. And actually, if somebody just thought, let's do an HIV test, let's not think about judgment. Let's not think about stigma. Let's just think about it could be a medical diagnosis. It's part of a differential. Let's just do a routine HIV test to rule it out if it isn't HIV, and if it is, to then do something about it, so we can actively treat people and stop them from getting sick, avoid them needing inpatient care.
So is there a bit of an issue that maybe doctors, GPs, feel that asking the question, do you mind if we also check for HIV, could be, they might think that might be offensive to somebody? Absolutely,
and I think they don't want to feel for a patient to feel judged by them, whereas in fact, anyone who has had unprotected sex should have an HIV test, and I think that is the vast majority of the population. But it's people understanding that if they rule it out, that's great, but the fact is they need to have a test before they know. And the stigma still interferes with that kind of medical pathway, and that is a hangover from the 80s that we haven't managed to get over. And we know, though, that actually the barrier is with the healthcare provider worrying about that judgment, as you say, Phil. But if you ask patients, they just want to have whatever is wrong with them diagnosed, and they will have any test. So we've actually looked at that in Brighton, in our community, and patients will consent to any test that they want. And actually, patients now attending our emergency department, we have an opt-out scheme where we have posters up, patient information leaflets, and we will test everybody for HIV unless somebody objects. We're also doing Hep C testing as well. That's also very important. And in allowing programs like that to happen, unfortunately, they always require funding or approval, but this worry about consent stems back to the 80s, when people couldn't get insurance if they had HIV, when they were treated differently if they had HIV. So we still have that hangover all these years later, even though we now have an effective treatment, to the point that somebody will not pass on HIV. That stigma, that need for consent still exists in people's heads. It's not actually necessary.
So I wondered the extent to which art can help in destigmatizing. Take the quilt for an example. I've not been to an exhibition or a venue where the quilt's been on display in the United Kingdom. That's not to say it hasn't been, but I've not come across it or been. A couple of those pictures from the Washington Mall I've not seen before, and they're staggering. So I wonder whether galleries and museums could step up a little bit. I've been to enough exhibitions of Tracy Emin's works, and with no disrespect to Tracy Emin, these are just as good creatively, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And actually carry real emotional punch, as you can imagine. In your position and people that you've worked with, does the use of the media, is that a kind of constant conversation about how can we get our message across, and to what extent does art, and I include in that, TV programs and short films and now, of course, social media, what role has that played and does that play?
It's very impactful. It's far more impactful than me going around giving a lecture, because I can only speak to a hall full of however many people, whereas a piece of art, as you've both said, looking at on the internet or seeing it in person, says something far more to you with far more depth than I can ever express. And it leaves you alone looking, understanding, thinking. And I think you can't underestimate that. And I think if you then have television programs or social media, people, when they know what I do, often talk to me about what they've seen in the paper, or when It's a Sin was on television, everybody was talking about It's a Sin. And it was a very real representation of what was happening.
For our international listeners, can you just explain what that was?
So It's a Sin was a serial on Channel 4, which is a UK channel. It was created by Russell T Davies, who is renowned for producing incredible drama, and it was encapsulating what was happening at the time to young gay men living in London. The social scene when HIV hit was first identified, when people were sick and they started to learn about HIV, and the fear that permeated that community at the time. And it for me, brought back memories of many amazing young people who I cared for in the wards who didn't survive. And it absolutely was true to what was happening at the time. And I think for that to have been represented with such integrity was powerful, both for people living with HIV, but also for those of us who cared for those people, because we were all hugely affected at that time. And I think people now living with HIV who survived that time still live with that. I mean, they saw their friends die in droves. Mm. And they were being stigmatized for having, a chronic disease. They were being, barrier nursed. They were being treated inhumanely by society for having something that we can now treat. But they were demonized for it. I mean, it was absolutely disgraceful how people were treated. And it happened. We've moved away somehow from that. It's better, but it's not where it should be. People should not have any judgment against them because they have an illness. We don't do it for any other illness.
No. But at the time, the families as well was the worst.
Oh, absolutely.
Because obviously the families, maybe they didn't even know the lifestyle that the people were living. And so then they were ill.
Yeah.
Then they died.
Yeah.
And then a lot of these people didn't actually get buried with their families with them. They may often have only had a couple of friends. And so it was bad enough that you sort of, the person's died, but then all their friends, their families rejected them. And that's tough.
My bugbear is with television, which is obviously what I've worked in for 40 years. Mm. It's so powerful. So we saw it recently with again in the UK, we've had a really disgraceful post office scandal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an awful story. And there was an ITV, most commercial channel, did a series on this a few weeks ago, which has caused finally an impact. And the government said, we're going to compensate everybody. And it was, we're going to go after the supplier, Fujitsu. And this has all been known for 10, 15 years. And many of these politicians who are now saying, well, yeah, we really tried to help, did absolutely nothing. So it's taken a TV channel to do that. Mm. Television is so powerful, and it really looks the other way practically all the time. So, I mean, we work in the arts, but I've done social docs. I mean, getting, the film about Afghanistan, 20 years working in Afghanistan, getting a TV channel to show that. In the end, funnily enough, it was ITV, but it was a struggle. Yeah. And I could name a couple of the other major channels that said, no one's interested. Well, they're not interested because you're not showing it. Yeah. And this is at a time when we have people out in Afghanistan, we're spending billions, people are dying, plenty of Afghans are dying. How can you say people aren't interested? Well, encourage people to be interested. So there's so many, there used to be, going back 20 years, 25, 30 years, there used to be these 9 p.m. documentary slots. They're virtually all gone.
Panorama.
The panoramas, the cutting edges, the true stories. I'm just talking about the UK, Modern Times, 40 Minutes, First Tuesday. And maybe they would have covered these, this is the kind of thing that should be in the public eye. And there's plenty of ways of discussing it. I mean, I hope, even with this podcast, that at the beginning, when, we introduced it and the words HIV came up, I hope, maybe some people thought, not sure. Yeah. I'm on a bus, I'm running, I'm jogging, I want to play. Like, this sounds a bit depressing. I hope people have stuck with it because it's,
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be, it is partly depressing, but it doesn't have to be entirely depressing. So the media, I think it does have a lot to answer for, frankly, and in so many different ways. We can see that all the time.
So can I mention an artist that someone told me about this week? And I'm going to shuffle some more papers. Because this person, I don't know if you know them or persons, they did do quite well worldwide. And the artists there were 3 of them, but the artists actually called General Idea. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
No.
And it was a group of 3 men that initially started, and they'd made a piece called Image Virus in 1987 to 91, which was based on the letter design of Robert Indiana's Love, which would have been in a block of 4, LOVE, 1965. And what they did in 1987 was they changed it to AIDS because they wanted the piece to be out there, not sweep the word under the carpet, to have the piece out there. And it really took off. It ended up on posters, bags, everything really did. And then, December the 1st, 1921, a company called Circa had the idea of taking general ideas, art piece, and turning it into a video virus. And on that World AIDS Day then, they did it all over the world. Piccadilly Circus, Times Square, they tried to link it with everywhere all over the world. One piece of art. And I think that's pretty good. They did really well with that. It did take off. 2 of the guys who initially worked, there was 3 of them died of AIDS. So it's an impactful piece, and it did work. So there can be a worldwide joining. You know, someone can pick up on and I think they will on the quilts. Quilts, maybe people were sort of like, they're a bit more sort of handmade and everything. But you know, I think I've talked to you about this, Yvonne, when my dad died, Donald's ago, he was had a shirt on. And the first thing I did was I had the shirt and I wanted to make something with it because it felt nice to make something, hold it, because he was wearing it. And it was, so you can connect with that little piece of fabric. Not all of them have just, they may have fabrics that are connected to the person, who knows. But there are a lot on those panels. And maybe someone had a piece of fabric and thought, I'm going to make this piece to pop in the quilt. So I think, it's certainly impactful.
So we thoroughly encourage you to, obviously there's been some images as you've been listening to this, but go on to as many websites as you can. I'll repeat the UK one again, or Laura would help me.
Yeah, it's here. It's there.
So,
but I think we'll pop a link in, won't we?
AIDSquiltuk.org. You won't find it hard to find videos about the US AIDS Memorial Quilt. It's quite extraordinary, and I really, really hope that you watch some of the short films that have been made about it. And have a look, have a think, and reflect on how, in this case, art has really done something very, very positive, in my opinion. So thank you, Yvonne, for bringing it to our attention. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it really has.
And thank you for inviting us here.
Actually, I feel quite honoured to do it. So sorry, Yvonne.
I'm really pleased because I'm really pleased. I thought you would, but I'm really pleased.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So did you want to say something else?
I just want to put a plug into everybody.
No, plug
who's
away.
Listening. If you've never had an HIV test, please go and have an HIV test. You can have it done at your GPs, in sexual health clinics, but you can also do it in the privacy of your own home. You can order tests online. If you're worried about walking in somewhere, it can be completely anonymous, but please, please, please do test, because it's better to know than not know, because we can really look after you and you can have a normal life expectancy with treatment.
And then we're going to try and release this on the 29th of April or around that date.
That time.
Yeah, when our national conference is happening.
Yes, so remind us why you were thinking that was a good date.
So we have our National British HIV Association Conference in Birmingham, the 29th of April to the 1st of May. Also at that time, we will be doing a session on This Morning with Alison Hammond to talk about emergency department testing and opt-out testing for HIV. So we really hope that listening today, you'll have a look at the quilt, you'll think about having an HIV test, and maybe catch up with us on the This Morning programme.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for listening to the Painting of the Week podcast. For more information, please visit our website at 7th-art.com or contact us by emailing info@7th-art.com. See you next time.